The arena was massive, stretching across the battlefield like an ancient Colosseum from Earth's past. Thousands of spectators filled the towering stands, their voices merging into a deafening roar. The war trials had begun, the greatest combat tournament in the galaxy, where only the strongest survived. Warriors from different planets, each more powerful than the last, had gathered to prove their strength. In the center of the battlefield stood Valkyra, the reigning champion. She was a Drakkai, a warrior race known for their immense strength, thick armor-like skin, and nearly unbreakable bones. She had won countless battles, crushing her enemies without effort. Her reputation was legendary. No one had ever lasted more than a few minutes against her. She raised her spear, her golden eyes scanning the battlefield. This year, another group of challengers had come, hoping to defeat her. Most of them were powerful, but none were worthy of her concern. However, one name on the list made her pause. Dan, a human. The crowd burst into laughter when his name was announced. Humans were not considered strong warriors in the galaxy. They had no claws, no fangs, no natural armor. Their home planet, Earth, was not a warrior's world. Compared to the monstrous fighters of the war trials, humans were small, weak, and fragile. Valkyra smirked. A human? Is this a joke? She said, looking toward the tournament officials. It is no joke, the announcer replied. He has passed the tests and qualified for the main event. Valkyra shook her head. She had fought massive reptilian beasts, energy-wielding cyborgs, and creatures with tentacles that could shatter steel. And now she was supposed to fight a human. This battle would be over before it even began. Then she saw him. Dan walked onto the battlefield with a calm expression. He was tall for a human, with short dark hair and sharp eyes that studied everything around him. He wore no heavy armor, just a flexible combat suit that allowed him to move freely. Unlike the other warriors, who roared and showed off their strength, he remained silent, focused. Valkyra frowned. Something about him felt different. He wasn't afraid. Most challengers looked at her with fear, but Dan's eyes held something else. Determination. The crowd booed and mocked him. Go back home, human. Someone shouted. You won't last 10 seconds. Another laughed. Dan ignored them. He didn't need to prove anything to the spectators. His mission was simple. Win. Valkyra stepped forward, towering over him. You should leave now, human, she said. I don't want to break you. Dan tilted his head. You think I'm that weak? Valkyra smirked. I know you are. Dan shrugged. Then let's find out. The announcer raised his hand. Warriors, prepare for battle. The crowd erupted with excitement as Valkyra tightened her grip on her spear. Dan stretched his arms, rolling his shoulders. He didn't look nervous. In fact, he looked excited. A loud gong echoed through the arena. The battle had begun. Valkyra wasted no time. She launched forward, her spear cutting through the air with incredible speed. She was faster than any human should have been able to react to. But just as the spear was about to pierce him, Dan dodged. The attack missed by inches. Valkyra's eyes widened. Impossible. No one had ever avoided her first strike so easily. Dan smiled. You're fast, he said, but not fast enough. Before she could react, he moved. His fist shot forward like a bullet, striking her armored shoulder. It wasn't enough to hurt her, but it was enough to make her take a step back. The crowd gasped. Valkyra stared at him in shock. No human should have been able to move like that. No human should have been able to react so quickly. Maybe, just maybe, she had underestimated him. Dan cracked his knuckles. Still think I'm weak? Valkyra grinned. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Excitement. This battle might not be so easy after all. The crowd was silent for a moment. No one could believe what they had just seen. A human, weak, fragile, and unimpressive by galactic standards, had dodged Valkyra's first attack and even struck back. It wasn't a powerful hit, but the fact that he had landed a blow at all was shocking. Then the silence broke into loud laughter and cheers. Some cheered for Valkyria, convinced that she was simply toying with her opponent. Others, however, started to wonder, was this human actually a real fighter? Valkyria narrowed her golden eyes. This was not what she had expected. She had seen many warriors fight, but none had ever moved like Dan. He was fast, precise, and calm. Most challengers charged at her with rage or fear. But Dan, he was studying her, learning her movements, planning something. She tightened her grip on her spear. No more games. With a roar, she charged again, her massive frame moving like a blur. This time, she didn't aim for a quick strike. She swung her spear in a wide arc, powerful enough to knock Dan off his feet. Dan's eyes focused. He could see the attack coming. Instead of stepping back, he moved forward, ducking under the swing at the last second. The spear passed just above his head, missing him by inches. Valkyria's attack hit the ground instead, causing a small explosion of dust and broken stone. She growled in frustration. This was not supposed to happen. Why was he so hard to hit? Dan smirked. That was close. Valkyria turned to face him. You're fast, human, but speed won't save you forever. Dan tilted his head. Speed isn't my only advantage. Before she could respond, he rushed forward. This time, he attacked first. His movements were unpredictable. 1 second he was aiming for her side, the next, he feinted and struck at her leg instead. Valkyria barely managed to block the attack with her armored arm, but the force of his punch still sent a shock through her muscles. He jumped back before she could counterattack. Valkyria's heart pounded. What was this fighting style? Most warriors relied on brute force or powerful weapons. But Dan was different. He studied his opponent, found weaknesses, and struck when they least expected it. She had underestimated him, but she wouldn't make that mistake again. With a deep breath, she calmed herself. This was no ordinary fight. She needed to be careful. No more reckless charges. No more assuming he was weak. The crowd sensed the change in her stance. The arrogance in her posture was gone. Now she was treating Dan like a true opponent. Dan noticed it too. Finally taking me seriously, he asked. Valkyria smirked. You've earned it. This time, she didn't rush in. She circled him, waiting, observing. Dan did the same. For the first time in the tournament's history, the human had forced the champion to change her tactics. The audience held their breath. Then, without warning, Valkyria attacked again, but differently. Instead of a powerful strike, she used speed and strategy, just like Dan. She faked a lunge to the right, making him dodge, then twisted at the last second and aimed a punch at his ribs. Dan barely avoided it, rolling to the side. She was learning. He grinned. Not bad. Valkyria smirked. You haven't seen anything yet. The battle had changed. It was no longer a simple fight. It was a test of skill, mind, and endurance. And neither of them planned to lose. The tension in the arena was thick. The crowd had stopped laughing. They had expected this fight to be over in seconds, yet here stood Dan, a human, facing Valkyria, the undefeated champion, without fear. Valkyria adjusted her stance, her golden eyes locked onto Dan. This was no longer just a fight. It was a challenge, one she had never expected to face. She had always crushed her opponents with raw power, but Dan had forced her to change her approach. For the first time in years, she was fighting someone who made her think. Dan, standing a few feet away, rolled his shoulders. He could feel the energy in the air. Valkyria was done underestimating him. Good. That meant she would start making smarter decisions. But he wasn't worried. He had fought bigger, stronger enemies before, and he knew one thing about warriors like her. They weren't used to losing. He smiled. So still think I'm weak? Valkyria smirked. We'll see. Then she moved. She didn't charge wildly like before. This time, she used controlled footwork, stepping in with precise movements. Her spear was ready, her muscles tensed like a coiled spring. Dan braced himself. This is it. Valkyra lunged, her spear slicing through the air with blinding speed. But instead of aiming for a direct hit, she feinted, pretending to strike at his left, while twisting at the last second to strike at his right side instead. Dan barely had time to react. He twisted his body, the tip of the spear grazing his side. The thin cut appeared on his suit, but he didn't slow down. In a flash, he grabbed her spear shaft with both hands and pulled. Valkyra's eyes widened. He's countering me. She pulled back, trying to regain control, but Dan was already moving. He planted his foot against her spear and pushed off, using the momentum to spin into a powerful kick to her shoulder. The impact echoed through the arena. Valkyra stumbled back, her grip on her spear loosening for just a second. Just a second. But it was enough. Dan didn't hesitate. He stepped in, slamming his fist into her armored stomach. The crowd gasped. Valkyra grunted as the force sent her sliding back across the arena floor. She had been hit. For the first time in years, someone had landed a real hit on her. She touched her stomach where Dan's punch had connected. Her thick armor had absorbed most of the impact, but she had felt it. Her eyes met Dan's. He wasn't breathing heavily. He wasn't backing away. He was smiling. The realization hit her. He's enjoying this. Dan clenched his fists. You're strong, no doubt about that. He took a step forward, but strength alone isn't enough to win. Valkyra smirked. This human was dangerous. She rolled her shoulders. Then I guess I'll have to fight smarter. Dan's grin widened. Now we're talking. The real fight had just begun. The crowd was on the edge of their seats. No one had ever seen Valkyra struggle in a fight before. She had always crushed her opponents with overwhelming power, ending battles in mere seconds. But now, standing across from her, was Dan, a human who had not only dodged her attacks, but had also landed a clean hit on her. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the lingering impact of his punch. It hadn't hurt much. Her armor-like skin had absorbed most of it. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he had hit her at all. Her golden eyes studied him carefully. This human, he was different. Most warriors relied on brute force or speed. Dan, however, fought with something else. Strategy. He wasn't just attacking blindly. He was watching, thinking, adapting. Valkyra smirked. You're not like the others. Dan cracked his knuckles. You're just figuring that out now. She chuckled. She had thought this fight would be boring, but instead, she felt a thrill she hadn't felt in years. A real challenge. She adjusted her grip on her spear and took a slow step forward. No more reckless attacks. This time, she would fight with her mind, as well as her strength. Dan noticed the shift in her stance. She had learned. Good, that made things more interesting. The two warriors circled each other. The air between them was tense. Neither moved yet. They were both waiting, watching for an opening. Then Valkyra attacked. She didn't use brute strength this time. Instead, she used speed and precision, feinting left before twisting her spear toward Dan's right side. Dan saw the trick. He dodged to the side, just barely avoiding the strike. But Valkyra had expected that. As soon as he moved, she shifted her weight and swung her leg forward, aiming for his ribs. Dan barely managed to block the kick with his forearm, but the force still sent him skidding back. His arm ached from the impact. She was fast. The crowd roared in excitement. Dan smirked. Not bad. Valkyra twirled her spear. You're not the only one who can learn. Dan nodded. This was going to be fun. Without warning, he lunged forward. Valkyra was ready. She swung her spear, but Dan wasn't aiming for her. At the last second, he changed direction, kicking up a cloud of dust from the ground. The dust flew into Valkyra's eyes. She instinctively blinked, losing sight of him for a split second. But that was all he needed. Before she could react, Dan was behind her. He spun and delivered a powerful kick to the back of her leg. Valkyra stumbled. The crowd gasped. Dan didn't stop. He followed up with a punch aimed at her side. But this time, she was ready. She caught his fist in her palm. Their eyes met. Valkyra grinned. Nice trick. Dan smirked. I've got plenty more. With a powerful twist, she threw him back. Dan flipped midair and landed on his feet, sliding back a few inches. The arena was silent for a moment. Then, the crowd exploded in cheers. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a battle of minds. Valkyra wiped the dust from her eyes. You fight differently than anyone I've faced before. Dan rolled his shoulders. Humans always do. She smirked. Good. Then I won't hold back anymore. Dan's grin widened. Neither will I. The real fight was just beginning. The arena pulsed with energy. The crowd was no longer laughing at Dan. They were watching. Every warrior in the stands, every spectator who had doubted him, now leaned forward, eyes locked on the battle. For the first time, Valkyra, the undefeated champion, was being pushed. She wiped the dust from her face, her golden eyes narrowing. She had underestimated him at first, assuming his human body was too weak to be a real threat. But Dan wasn't fighting like the others. He wasn't relying on brute strength. He was thinking. And worst of all, he was enjoying this. Dan rolled his shoulders, his grin never fading. His body ached from her powerful attacks, but he had been through worse. He had fought against impossible odds before. He had survived before. Valkyra twirled her spear. You're still standing. Dan smirked. Was I supposed to fall? She chuckled. You will. Then she attacked. This time, there was no hesitation, no feints. Pure speed and power. Her spear lashed out in rapid strikes, each one fast enough to tear through steel. Dan dodged left, right, back, barely keeping up. The wind from her attacks whipped past his face. Then, the hit. Her spear clipped his side, sending a shock of pain through his ribs. He gritted his teeth but didn't stop moving. He had expected this. He wasn't fighting to avoid pain. He was fighting to win. Dan used the momentum of her attack to roll backward, landing on his feet. He exhaled sharply, touching his side. The wound wasn't deep. He could still fight. Valkyra smirked. Still think you can keep up? Dan wiped sweat from his forehead. I know I can. She lunged again. But this time, Dan didn't dodge. Instead, he stepped forward. The crowd gasped. Valkyra's spear missed by inches, and before she could recover, Dan was inside her guard. He struck. A punch to the stomach. Valkyra's eyes widened. She felt the impact through her armor. Dan didn't stop. He twisted and delivered a spinning kick to her ribs, sending a shockwave through her body. Valkyra stumbled back. The crowd exploded. Dan wiped his chin. You're strong. No doubt about that. He met her gaze. But strength alone doesn't win fights. Valkyra clenched her jaw. She had never been hit this much before. Her body ached. But more than that, she felt something new. Excitement. She had always crushed her enemies with raw power, but Dan had forced her to fight differently. She took a deep breath. For the first time in years, she was truly fighting. She smirked. Good. Let's see how far you can push me. Dan cracked his knuckles. Let's find out. The real battle was just beginning. The arena was electric with excitement. No one had expected Dan to last this long. The mighty Valkyra, undefeated champion of the war trials, was actually being challenged by a human. Valkyra wiped sweat from her forehead, her breathing heavier than before. Dan's attacks weren't the strongest she had ever faced, but they were precise. Every punch, every kick, every dodge, it was all part of a strategy. He was studying her, learning her movements, predicting her attacks. And worst of all, it was working. Dan stood a few feet away, hands clenched into fists. He could feel the ache in his ribs where her spear had struck him earlier, but he ignored the pain. He had fought through worse. Pain was temporary. Victory was forever. The crowd roared for the battle to continue. Vakira smirked. "You're making me work harder than I expected." Dan rolled his shoulders. "You're not the first to underestimate humans." She laughed. "You're not like the other warriors I've faced." She raised her spear. "But that won't save you." Dan grinned. "I don't need saving." And then, they moved. Vakira lunged forward, her spear slicing through the air like lightning. Dan didn't back away. He charged straight at her. The crowd gasped. Was he crazy? At the last second, Dan dropped to the ground, sliding beneath her spear. The blade missed him by inches. Vakira's eyes widened. He was already behind her. Dan spun on his hands, kicking out with both legs. His boots slammed into her back, sending her stumbling forward. The crowd exploded. Vakira caught herself, digging her spear into the ground to stop her fall. She twisted around, golden eyes flashing. He was fast, faster than she had thought possible. But she wasn't done yet. She launched forward again, swinging the spear in a wide arc. This time, Dan didn't dodge. Instead, he raised his arms and caught the spear. The force of the impact made his muscles burn, but he held on tight. Vakira pushed, trying to break his grip. Dan pushed back. For a moment, the two warriors were locked in a battle of strength. The crowd held their breath. Then, Dan smirked. He suddenly let go. Vakira, caught off guard, staggered backward. In that split second of imbalance, Dan attacked. A punch to her ribs. A kick to her knee. A final strike to her shoulder. Vakira fell to one knee. The arena went silent. Dan stepped back, breathing hard but standing strong. For the first time ever, Vakira had been brought down. She looked up at him, her golden eyes filled with something unexpected. Respect. She smiled. "You're more than just a warrior, human." She stood slowly, rolling her shoulders. "You're a fighter." Dan smirked. "And I'm not done yet." Vakira laughed, gripping her spear tighter. "Neither am I." The battle wasn't over. But now, it was a fight between equals. The arena was silent for a moment. No one could believe what had just happened. Vakira had fallen to one knee. Dan stood a few feet away, his breathing heavy but steady. His body ached from Vakira's powerful strikes, but he ignored the pain. Pain didn't matter. Winning did. Vakira slowly rose to her feet. She rolled her shoulders, shaking off the shock. A grin spread across her face. She hadn't been this excited in years. "You're something else, human," she said, gripping her spear tightly. Dan smirked. "Took you long enough to figure that out." The crowd finally exploded into cheers. Warriors from across the galaxy had gathered to see another easy victory for their champion. But now, they were witnessing something different. This wasn't just a fight. This was a war between two unstoppable warriors. Vakira adjusted her stance, her golden eyes locked onto Dan. This time, there was no arrogance in her gaze, only respect. "No more games," she said. "Now we fight for real." Dan grinned. "Good. I was getting bored." Then, they moved. Vakira struck first. She lunged forward with blinding speed, her spear slicing through the air like a lightning bolt. But Dan was ready. He sidestepped at the last second, dodging just by inches. He twisted his body and launched a counterattack, a quick jab to her side. Vakira blocked it with her forearm. She spun, using the momentum to swing the spear in a sweeping arc. Dan ducked low, rolling forward to close the distance. He knew she had the advantage at long range. If he wanted to win, he had to fight up close. Vakira realized his plan and kicked out before he could reach her. Dan barely managed to block, but the impact sent him sliding backward. The crowd gasped. He gritted his teeth. She was stronger than anyone he had ever faced. But he wasn't done. He charged forward again, this time faster. He threw a quick feint to her left, forcing her to react. She moved her spear to block, but it was a trick. At the last second, Dan twisted and struck from the right instead. His fist connected with her ribs. Valkyria grunted, stepping back. The hit had landed, but she wasn't finished. She countered with a powerful knee strike. Dan barely managed to dodge, but her speed was incredible. Before he could recover, she swung her spear again. The weapon grazed his shoulder, cutting through his suit. A thin line of blood appeared, but Dan didn't even flinch. Valkyria's eyes widened. How was he still standing? Most warriors would have collapsed by now. Most fighters would have given up. But Dan kept fighting. He wiped the blood from his shoulder and smirked. That all you got? Valkyria laughed. You really don't know when to quit. Dan raised his fists. Humans don't quit. The two warriors circled each other again. The fight was far from over. But one thing was clear. Dan was not like any opponent Valkyria had ever faced. The arena was alive with energy. The warriors in the crowd had never seen anything like this before. A human was holding his own against Valkyria, the undefeated champion. Dan stood firm, his breathing heavy but steady. His body ached from Valkyria's powerful strikes, but his mind was sharp. He wasn't going to fall. Valkyria, gripping her spear, was feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Excitement. She had fought countless warriors before, but none of them had pushed her like this. None of them had made her fight with everything she had. She wiped sweat from her forehead and smirked. You should have fallen by now. Dan chuckled. You're not the first to think that. The crowd roared. This was no longer a simple fight. This was a war between two unstoppable forces. Valkyria took a deep breath and adjusted her stance. She could see it now. Dan wasn't just strong. He was smart. He was unpredictable. She had relied on her strength and speed for years, crushing enemies without effort. But Dan, he was forcing her to think. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure how this fight would end. Dan cracked his knuckles. Let's finish this. Valkyria grinned. Agreed. Then they moved. Valkyria struck first, lunging with incredible speed. Her spear shot forward, aiming straight for Dan's chest. Dan dodged to the side, just in time. The spear barely grazed his skin. But he wasn't just dodging, he was countering. As her attack missed, he spun to her unguarded side and delivered a powerful punch to her ribs. Valkyria grunted but didn't back away. Instead, she twisted her body and brought her knee up. Dan saw it coming at the last second. He blocked, but the force sent him skidding backward. The two warriors stared at each other. Both were breathing hard. Both were pushing their limits. Valkyria smirked. You're still standing. Dan rolled his shoulders. I told you. Humans don't quit. She laughed. Good. Then let's end this the right way. She threw her spear to the side. Dan blinked in surprise. No weapon. Valkyria raised her fists. No tricks. No advantages. Just warrior against warrior. Dan grinned. Now you're speaking my language. The crowd went wild. The final round had begun. The two warriors charged at each other, one last time. The arena trembled with excitement. The crowd had never seen a fight like this before. Valkyria, the undefeated champion, had thrown aside her weapon. This was no longer just a match. This was a battle between equals. Dan wiped the sweat from his forehead and grinned. His entire body ached, but he didn't care. This was what he lived for. Valkyria rolled her shoulders, her golden eyes burning with determination. One last round, human. Dan clenched his fists. Let's make it count. Then, they moved. Valkyria struck first, throwing a powerful punch aimed at Dan's ribs. Dan blocked, twisting his body to absorb the impact. He countered with a sharp jab to her side. Vakira dodged by inches and swung her leg in a wide arc. Dan saw it coming. He ducked just in time. The air above him rippled from the force of her kick. The crowd gasped. Dan twisted and launched a spinning back kick. Vakira caught his leg. For a split second, they locked eyes. Dan smirked. Not bad. Vakira grinned. You too. She threw him back. Dan landed on his feet, skidding a few inches. The arena exploded with cheers. They charged at each other again. Dan ducked under Vakira's punch and aimed a strike at her chest. She blocked. Vakira countered with a knee to his stomach. He dodged. Punch. Block. Counter. Dodge. The fight became a blur of movement. Both warriors were moving at their absolute limits. Then, Vakira made a mistake. For just a moment, she hesitated. Dan saw the opening. He moved instantly. A fist to her stomach, a kick to her legs, a final strike to her chest. Vakira staggered. Dan took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had one last chance. With all the strength he had left, he charged forward and launched one final punch. Vakira raised her arms to block, but the force was too strong. The impact sent her sliding backward. She dropped to one knee. Silence. The entire arena froze. Dan stood there, breathing hard. He waited. Was it over? Vakira looked up at him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled. She let out a breath and slowly stood up. Then, to everyone's shock, she bowed. Dan blinked. Wait, does that mean? Vakira chuckled. It means you won. The crowd erupted into cheers. Dan rubbed the back of his neck. Didn't think you'd admit it so easily. Vakira smirked. I respect strength. You earned this victory, human. She extended her hand. Dan looked at it for a second, then shook it. The fight was over, but the respect between warriors would last forever.